Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Charles Burgess King. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army and the war in Iraq. He's also the founder of the Veterans Higher Education Corporation. And Charles, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Greg.
You were actually born in Liberia. Tell us a little bit about your family there and what it was like growing up.
Yes, I'm originally from Monrovia, Liberia. Interesting story, I was adopted. My adopted family actually worked, my biological family, actually worked for my adopted family. It's a bit tricky. And so when my parents were very young, when they had me and were in no position to really take care of a child, and that was when my adopted family stepped in and sort of raised me. So I was really raised by my adopted family, and frankly, that's really the only family I know. And so I have 4 sisters. When I speak of my family, I'm speaking of my adopted family, which is the family that raised me. So I was raised in Liberia until about 10, 12 years old, and my family moved to the United States during the midst of the Civil War, and that was actually what brought me here.
Talk about the intensity of that Civil War and what the impact was on your family.
Well, I was a child, but I do remember a few things. My mom had left my grandmother in charge to babysit my sister and I, and she had went for, I think, some event or something. And basically, I remember hearing guns firing, like gunshots going off, and there must have been like different checkpoints and borders and perimeters set up. And so basically, my mother was stuck where she was, and we were stuck where we were because she couldn't get back to us. But thankfully, my grandmother was there with my sister and I. I remember it was seeing like the rebels, but my family and I were indoors, were in the house pretty much for the most part. Thankfully, we had food and all of the necessities, but we didn't really go out very much because my grandmother was afraid of something not only happening to us, but she didn't really want any activity of people exiting or entering because she didn't know who was looking, who was watching, who would follow, that sort of thing. So at the time, she communicated with my mom via phone calls. That's pretty much most of what I remember. I do remember I would hear, like the missiles and guns firing, but I didn't really see any of those things because we were pretty much stuck in the house.
So how long were you separated from your parents?
We were separated, I would say, for about a month. And the reason being was because, it was the rebels that were taking over the entire city. And so they had set up different checkpoints in different areas. And so if you wanted to make it back to, where you were going, you'd have to go through whatever checkpoint they had set up, in addition to whatever checkpoints the military had set up. And there was chances, a lot of people were just afraid that they would not have made it back. So at that point, we were basically communicating with my parents, or families were communicating with other family members through via phone calls to tell them, where they were, that they were fine, where they should go, that sort of thing. And so we were separated from my mom for about a month, but my mother at the time wanted to have us sent somewhere that was safer, which was to an uncle's that lived, probably about 20 minutes from where we lived. But it was a difficult thing because we lived smack dab in the city, and that was really where most of the activity was going on. And, at that time they were capturing people, taking little boys, taking little girls. So it was a very scary time. And my grandmother and my mother did not want to take any chances of having us try to relocate during the midst of all of that. So when things sort of slowed down, my mother came back home, and we then went to our uncles who lived more in like the countryside area.
And how quickly after that did you leave the country?
So that's a very interesting story. I had been the first time I came to America, I was probably 4 or 5 years old. But I came for a wedding. I was a ring bearer, and my mother took me back home. And she had been trying to get me visitation visa for many, many years to come here, but it just never worked out. And so my mother had a close friend who was an American citizen, but she was married to a Liberian guy. And so when the war broke out and everything was, really difficult, her friend decided that she was going to take her kids and go to the U.S. Embassy, and try to get out of there. And so my mother then told her, because my mother at the time actually wasn't there, my mother said, is there any way that you could take me and my sister with you to the U.S. Embassy, and by the time I get back, I would try to come and get them from you. And so her friend ends up taking my sister and I, and she was with her husband and her kids, and we went to the U.S. Embassy. And actually, once she told them that she was an American citizen and she had her passport, and these are my kids, these are my family, they pretty much just like rushed us through the gate through the U.S. Embassy. And she called my mom, or she was able to get in touch with my mother, and told her that we had been they had us in the embassy. And she said, but hey, I'm planning on going back to the States. My oldest sister lived in the States at the time. And so she said, I think it would be a wise idea for all of us to just go along, so that way the kids are fine. You don't have to worry as much. And so, as fate would have it, that was literally how we came to the United States, because we were technically all of her kids. So we left from the U.S. Embassy in Liberia. We were airlifted to Ghana, caught a flight to the Ivory Coast, we were in the Ivory Coast maybe for a couple of weeks, left from there, caught a connecting flight through Senegal, and actually landed at Dulles Airport. Wow. And my sister, I had a sister at the time who lived in Fairfax. And so my mother had gotten in touch with her and say, your brother and your sisters are coming, so meet them at the airport, that sort of thing. And so that was actually how we came to the United States.
That's an amazing story. Eventually, you get to Massachusetts.
Yes.
And that's where you graduated high school. And then it's shortly after that you decide to join the Army. What went into that decision?
Well, truthfully speaking, I've always been a studious kid. I always knew I wanted to go to school and study. And at the time, I remember my sister telling me that they may not be able to afford paying for my tuition. But I honestly, I didn't really know what that meant. So even though they had the whole conversation with me, I was still submitting college applications as if, everything was just going to work out in the end. And so I remember thinking to myself, Charles, you want to go to school, and you're going to go to school, but, you find something else to do besides like partying, et cetera, et cetera. And so I said, well, I'm going to join the National Guard. I will say it was a big push from my family for financial reasons. But at the time, I remember feeling as though I had no interest or any desire to join the military, because in my mind, I thought it meant to join. To join meant to go to war. And that's not what I wanted to do. And so I said, well, I'll join the National Guard because it's 1 week in a month, 2 weeks in the summer. I'm not really going anywhere. I get to go to school and I get to do this, and they'll pay for tuition and all that stuff. So at the time I thought, okay, you have a plan. So I graduated from high school, went off to basic training, came back actually the day before Thanksgiving, started spring semester at Dean College in Massachusetts. In January, my unit was mobilized in February to go to Iraq. I think this was probably around 2001 or 2002. because 9/11 happened in 2001. So it was around 2002. And so my unit was mobilized in February, and I was scared. I was scared because I didn't know what I was up against. I had just finished basic training, just got into school. I'm thinking, life is going to be all school, and I have the 1 week in a month, 2 weeks in the summer obligation. And so I get military orders saying that as of such and such date, you're no longer in school and you have to report to this unit. Keep in mind, I had never even been to my unit before. I had never met anyone at this unit. So I literally had to get out of school, move out of my dorm room, and my Monday to Friday routine was going and reporting to my unit in preparation to deploy to Iraq.
So how long did you do that before you actually deployed?
The processing period probably, I'd say, took about 6 months. We spent a lot of time in Massachusetts because we were waiting for a lot of our equipment to get there. After we received like Humvees and all the things that we needed to go overseas with, my unit, we drove down to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and that was where we did a lot of our training and in processing to get ready to go overseas. So I'd say from that time up until I got to Fort Dix and left Fort Dix, it was probably around 7-8 months, the whole thing in its entirety. And then we arrived in Kuwait. We were at a military base called Doha, Camp Doha. And then from there, which was like they're in processing for being on ground. And then from there, my unit went up to Iraq.
Charles, let's pause right there. We'll pick up your story when we come right back on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined in studio today by Charles Burgess King, veteran of the U.S. Army and the war in Iraq. He's also the founder of the Veterans Higher Education Corporation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, Charles, when we left off, we were talking about suddenly being forced to leave school, joining your National Guard unit, and then eventually heading to the Middle East. Yes. So, when we left off, you were in Kuwait, and when was that?
Oh, I remember we arrived during the summer. I know because it was really hot. It must have been sometime around June, July. I don't remember exactly what month it was, but I remember it was summer because it was excruciatingly hot. It was dry and hot heat. And there were a lot of units actually that, were being deployed to Iraq, but Camp Doha was basically where they went to wait until their equipment arrived and caught up with them, and then, then convoyed up to Iraq, wherever they may have been assigned to go.
And so where did your unit go in Iraq?
My unit went to air base called Talil Air Base in Iraq. It was an Air Force base, but they had Army units as well as civilian contractors that were on the base as well. So that's where we were.
And what were your responsibilities?
So my MOS was admin. So I basically did administrative work. But when we got there, we actually didn't technically start doing our jobs because we were trying to set up shop. First of all, a lot of us were processing the fact that we're now like in this country where, at least for me, I had only seen or imagined on a map. I never imagined that I would be standing in Iraq at some days where it would be, 100 degrees, some days would be like 115. So when we got there, we were just trying to really set up shop. I'll give you an example. We have found a few abandoned buildings that we ended up turning into like office spaces. Thankfully, a few of the guys in our units had background in construction and building, so they helped build like extensions to these buildings for different offices. So that was where we ended up working out of. on the flip side, there was this area that was pretty much, it was called Tent City, which was basically where we all went to like sleep. But it was these industrial-sized tents. But they had just put them up, but no one was really living there. So as units were coming in, you pretty much just took over whatever area that was available for your unit. Started to set up shop slowly but surely, and at the same time going back and forth between Kuwait and Iraq to get all of our supplies and everything that was shipped over for us to be there. My unit's job basically was to support units below us because I was in a battalion. So we would get orders from headquarters, and we would pretty much pass it down to the lower ranking units, executed.
A couple different interesting things you worked on while you were there. First of all, just basic hygiene and sanitation was a major concern.
It was when we got to Iraq, there was nothing there. We had to pretty much burn waste at the end of the day because we didn't have any running toilets. So basically we had built like a wooden box. In the box there was we got like a little metal barrel that would go underneath, and so on a daily basis, lower ranking soldiers, including myself, would be assigned to, take out this metal bin, transport it, somewhere that was in a distance of where our office was located, and pretty much burn everything because that's the only way we could get rid of it. Later on, they ended up building showers and toilets and all that stuff. But for the first, I'd say, 6 to 8 months, that's what we were doing. Just because we were trying to just we built literally everything from scratch.
Was that something engineering-wise that a lot of you guys had experience in, or is it something you just had to figure out?
That's something we had to figure out, and we figured it out in conjunction with other engineering and transportation units that were also on the base. So if we needed to have a connex moved from one location to another location, we would, write an order tasking whatever engineering unit or transportation unit to do it for us. There are people who had taken connexes and pretty much made offices out of it. So we pretty much just improvised for the first year. I'd say was all everybody was just trying to figure out, their little space, whether it was at work or it was in Tent City where they were trying to figure out their little space in the tent, build a little shelf to put things on, and sort of get some sort of structure going.
Amazing American ingenuity. We see it in every generation of American troops, and it's fascinating. Charles, we'll take one more break here. We'll come back with the rest of your story on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined in studio today by U.S. Army veteran and Iraq War veteran Charles Burgess King. He's also the founder of the Veterans Higher Education Corporation, and we'll get to that a little bit later in this conversation. And Charles, we were talking about the ingenuity that you and your unit and other units you collaborated with dealt with in terms of hygiene and sanitation. There's also an interesting story that you made us aware of about the idea of rest stops in Iraq, as the troops were obviously shuttling personnel and machinery all sorts of places around the country. Talk about how you noticed this need and eventually acted on it.
So actually it came from my own personal experience. When we, every time we drove to and from Iraq, in the very beginning stages of us getting there, thankfully I was never assigned to drive. I was always just I was just in the back of one of the Humvees. And truthfully, there were moments, it was probably about a 4 or 5 hour drive. Truthfully, there were times where I fell asleep. I wasn't supposed to. But because it was hot, we were tired, and we had this long drive that we were embarking on. And so we would oftentimes stop along the way. But it was very brief because we weren't surrounded by anything. And oftentimes you would see civilians in the distance coming towards the convoy, but you never knew who they were or possibly what they had. And even furthermore, if they would cause any harm or not. So oftentimes when we stopped, it was really just, for folks to pee or, drink water, some stuff like that. But that was the routine, folks going to and from Iraq, between Kuwait. That was just how it were for a while. Fast forward to once we got settled and everything, of course, we got care packages every day. Some of us got care packages from our family, and then we just got care packages from different organizations. So we had an entire room of whatever you could think of that was in there. And, food, hygiene resources, all types of things. And some of those things we never really used. And so as it got to a point where things sort of slowed down and we weren't really busy as a unit, and everyone was just trying to figure out how to keep themselves busy. And so I went to my commander and I said, I have this idea. If we could take a Connex, put it on somewhere on the road, and sort of take a lot of the things we had been accumulating from the care packages, so that way if there's a convoy going along the way, they can stop, and if they needed water, a muffin, whatever they needed, we would have it, just to create this rest stop. And at first he was like, okay, I see where you're going, but how are we going to actually manufacture this thing and like walk me through it? And who's going to manage it? So I said, well, we have all of the care package supplies that we're never going to use, because in addition to having all of that stuff, we bought things for ourselves. So there was an abundance of stuff. And so I said, well, what I'm thinking we could do is maybe task one of the engineering units to put a Connex somewhere along the road. It was probably about a 5 to 7 miles radius from the base. So we weren't that far away. And every morning, we had a roster. And every morning, 2 people from the unit would be assigned to, fill up the trucks with things from our care package room, so to speak, and take it there for a few hours. We knew what units were coming in and going out. And so, they would stop. If they needed, whatever they needed, that we had, we would just give it to them. And so it started off being really small. It was just folks from my unit, primarily me, because it was an idea that I brought up, or that I came up with. And so, we did it a few days a week. And then as we were getting more care package supplies, we would take more things out, but then we noticed that a lot of people would stop along the way. They would grab whatever they needed, and continue with their journey. Interestingly so, it got to a point where even the Iraqi police officers would also stop along the way and ask us for hygiene products and food and all of that sort of stuff. So then the more things we got from care packages, we ended up actually taking all of those things and diversifying it and starting this initiative. Next thing you know, my commander had sent out a memorandum to the units below us to see if he could get more people to volunteer, soldiers that we could put on this roster to sort of rotate and have everyone take a shift to expand the days that we would be doing this, and possibly go for a longer period of time with MP support, so we could have a little rest stop operation going on with security for troops traveling to and from Iraq and Kuwait to stop and grab whatever they needed. So I was pretty excited about that.
You must have been pretty popular too.
I kind of was. I don't want to brag. I kind of was, but it was just one of the things I did to sort of keep myself busy. I also would cut hair. I mean, we all had to do the military haircut, so I wasn't doing anything fancy. But because at the time I was really into grooming, so a lot of guys from my unit would be like, hey, give me a haircut, just buzz or whatever, and I would charge them $3. So I ended up having a little change from just cutting folks' hair in my unit. But the the rest stop idea was actually really fun because it also gave us an opportunity to go off base. And it gave us an opportunity to meet civilians. And they got to meet us. And sometimes they would stay and we would just talk and chat. I met a physicist that was 21 years old. It was a great opportunity. I enjoyed the exposure of getting to meet folks that I know I would have never met or crossed paths with ever in my life had that opportunity not came about.
Then you came back and you continued to pursue education. I want you to talk about that, but also the combination.
Yeah.
Military service and education. So explain how this all unfolded.
So it's interesting. I will say the large portion, it took me a while to really get sifted into the reality that I was in Iraq for an indefinite period of time. And the reason why I say that is because we kept getting dates of when we would come back to the States, but it always changed. So at some point, I stopped believing. And I didn't really know when I was going to come back. I actually never took leave because I was afraid that if I come back, I would get so used to the comforts of life that it would be difficult to go back. So I never took any leave. In my mind, I'm thinking just stay here and just bulldoze through the time you're supposed to be here, and then when you leave, you leave. So, but back to your point about education. When we came back from Iraq, I decided to get back into school. And so I went back to Dean College, and of course they knew my reasons for why I left to begin with. And so I re-enrolled in school, and I did a year and transferred to Chapman University in Orange County, California. I used my GI Bill during my undergraduate studies, and alongside like some academic scholarships I had received. So I studied at Chapman University. I majored in film and finance. Graduated, took on a job at Sony Pictures, and later went to work for Morgan Freeman's film production company in Santa Monica. During the midst of that experience, I decided to go back to graduate school. At the time, I wanted to go to UCLA. Actually, before I get there, I'll tell you something that happened, and then it'll all make sense. So when I graduated from college, from Chapman, I was very nervous about finding a job. And within the film industry, it was just hard to get even an internship. And so I remember graduating, and the summer I graduated, I was coming down on myself really hard because I'm like, here I've invested this much money in school, and the summer I graduated was when I realized that it didn't matter what school I went to. I was just like every other postgraduate student. And the name of the university didn't, like, I couldn't walk into an office and say, I went to Chapman, here, give me a job and pay me this much amount of money. And so then I remember saying to myself, and I said a prayer, and I said, God, whatever it is, I just want something that belongs to me. I said, because the reason why I want that is because when I eventually move on to have a family, I would love to tell my kids that, I started such and such at such and such age. And I said, I just want it before I turned 30. Mind you, I was probably around 24, 25 at the time. So 30 felt like 50. And so I said, I just want it before I turn 30 because I don't want to be too old when this happens. So I had that whole moment, worked, decided to apply to graduate school at UCLA. I was waitlisted, and my family said, well, just move back east. And so I said, well, if I move back east, I want to go to Harvard. I don't really want to go anywhere else. I've never been to Harvard. I've never even seen the campus. But somewhere in my mind, I want to go to Harvard. And so my boss at the time told me, he said, I think you think in pictures. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, you sort of visualize where you want to be, and you manifest it to happen. He said, it's actually a gift. He's like, when you think of, folks who are blind, he's like, that has a special skill. It's almost like they see it in their minds. And he's like, it sounds to me like that's what's going on with you. And so I said, yeah, no, I have never been to Harvard. I know it exists, but I don't. That's really all I know. And so I moved back to Massachusetts. I emailed a few professors at Harvard because I said, Charles, before you make the sacrifice in applying or figuring out how you're going to get into this institution, at least see if you belong here. And the only way you could do that is by auditing a few courses. And so I had emailed about 10 professors, and only one got back to me. And he said, we usually don't do audits during the summer session, but you're welcome to come in and just sit. So that's okay. So I dedicated myself to going and just sitting in his class for his summer session. And at the end, I remember thinking to myself, oh, I got this. I totally got this. It's fine. But then I began to look at what it would cost and what I needed to apply to Harvard graduate program. At the time, I was thinking I wanted to go to the business school. And so I said, okay, well, it's Harvard Business School. I almost have to invent teeth to get in here, and that's already been done. I have a good GPA, but there's got to be more. And then I looked at how much it cost, and at the time, it was about $83,000 a year. And so I said, okay, well, I had already used my GI Bill. I couldn't wrap my head around taking out loans for 2 or 3 years for that. So I said, okay, well, let me look and see what's available for scholarships and grants. And I didn't really find anything because afterwards, a business degree is a sort of, there wasn't really much. So I said, well, let me see what's available for military veterans. And I started researching. And I found 1 or 2 things, but nothing substantial. So I said, well, what I'm going to do is whatever I have left of my GI Bill, I'm going to take a few classes in hopes that once I've completed it, I would have figured out a plan. And so I met with my advisor during that time. And I had previously, I was home randomly, and I was thinking of, how am I going to pay for school? And so I said, okay, well, Charles, there's really nothing out there that's available. So I literally said to myself, well, why don't you just start your own? But I don't remember. I honestly couldn't tell you what I was thinking to start. So I went to my advisor and I said, I have this idea to launch a veterans initiative that will provide academic scholarships for veterans obtaining a graduate level degree, because that's the position I was in. And so he said, well, it's a very compelling idea. He said, if you can get that off the ground successfully, you will write your ticket through Harvard Business, because that's sort of the prototype that they would look for, I can imagine. He said, and, lots of companies and corporations are now creating a lot of avenues for veterans that, frankly, were never there before. So if you could do something like that, this would be a great time in history, or in your history at least, to start something like that. And so that's literally how I came up with the idea to start Veterans Higher Education Corporation. I remember thinking to myself, I said, well, it's veterans, it's higher education. I said, I don't want to name it foundation because it's going to sound like I'm begging for money. But I'm going to say it's a corporation because I want it to be that big. And in my mind, that's really how I saw it. But throughout this time, I never forgot that the whole purpose of this was to pay for me to go to school. And for the majority of the time, like the first year of me starting the company, I kept that. I was very mindful of that. And I was mindful of it until different things and opportunities came along the way that helped me really build the company and get it and build it from the ground up. And I started meeting strangers, folks that I didn't know, that had the same challenge and issues as I had as it pertained to, going back to school. And it dawned on me that, oh, okay, this is much bigger than myself. And I remember feeling an immense sense of gratitude to be the messenger, to have dreamt this dream, and now to see it in fruition. It was really a scary thing to watch. And I shied away from it for a long time because when I called, I remember, I'll give an example. I called the IRS and I said, I don't know what an EIN number is, but I know I need one. And they said, you fill out this paperwork and you get it. And I said, oh, okay. Called, I think, the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts, and I said, well, I need to have this thing incorporated. Well, you fill this paperwork out, you pay this fee, and poof, you have it. And I thought, oh. And then next thing you know, I'm like, you're telling me I have an incorporation? You're telling me I have my own number? And then I started to process it. In the midst of that, of all of that, I took on a job in retail because I needed to pay for some of these things. As fate would have it, I met a wonderful gentleman who was an IP lawyer at WilmerHale. I had no idea who WilmerHale was. And then he comes and after a few conversations, he's like, I really love this idea. I would love to pitch it to our pro bono committee to see if we can represent you and help you launch this initiative from the ground up. And that's literally when I would say Veterans Higher Education was born, because they helped me get it recognized on a federal and a state level. My 501c took 8 months to get, which I heard was unheard of from colleagues who had started nonprofit initiatives, because they said it just took them forever to get through that process. I went to Bank of America to open a bank account because it didn't dawn on me that I needed a business account. And I was paying for everything through my personal checking. And I'm sitting in front of one of their marketing directors, and he's reading through all of this supporting materials that I brought with me. And he, at the end, tells me, I would love to pass on your information to one of our higher-ups, because this is a very compelling idea and story to help veterans. He said, I never thought about the graduate level. I never thought, he's like, I don't know much about veterans, but I never thought about the graduate level. Everyone thinks about the undergraduate level. And this was probably, 4 or 5 years ago. And 4 or 5 years ago, I told him, I said, master's and graduate degree is now bachelor's degree. Bachelor's degree isn't really getting, it's replaced, So that's how Bank of America ended up coming on. So the whole journey of launching this initiative, what is most touching to me is the fact that it feels as though I never had to sell the idea. I never had to push it. It was very direct. It was very plain. It was very clear. And folks felt compelled to say, how can I help? Or, how can we help you get here? And so as I make decisions now as founder and CEO, I always keep that in mind, not to push too hard or get too aggressive or try to sell the idea too aggressively. Because in my mind, I feel like I never had to do that. Certain situations were just ordained. And so I'm always cognizant and mindful of that.
Last question for you, Charles. How many veterans have you been able to help to date, and what's the feeling like for you when you see the lives that have changed because of your vision for this?
So right now, I actually just landed my first university partnership with Boston College. And I am working on the inaugural cohort of veterans. And what I mean by that is I'm currently fundraising to launch my first cohort of veterans. So we haven't launched the cohort yet, but my goal is to have a small cohort ready by fall 2020.
The ambition and the vision have been there all along. I have no doubt that you're going to meet that goal. So
I hope so.
Best wishes as you continue to help those that you served alongside, and I'm sure many others. And thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.
And thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Charles Burgess King, veteran of the U.S. Army, the war in Iraq as well, and he's the founder and CEO of the Veterans Higher Education Corporation. I'm Greg Columbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.